Thank you, Larry. Thanks for that great introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to present some of my latest research and thoughts on firm performance. Let me share my screen here. Okay. So I am going to today talk about firm performance. And in doing so, I'm going to review three and a little bit of a fourth paper, some research I've been doing on this topic. I'm going to provide what I think might be some provocative statements. I'm trying to be provocative, trying to generate some discussion, and maybe we'll have that at the end if there are any questions. And after the statements, I will try to kind of go through the research that underlies the reason why I'm trying to make that statement. Okay, so if you're here, you're probably a strategy researcher. And I thank Karma for trying to integrate more and more strategy research in the sessions and short courses. It's an outlet that we don't really have in strategy. It's very popular, both ORM, Karma, for micro researchers, and it is over time, I think, and thankfully, integrating more and more strategy research. So my guess is, though, that you are a strategy researcher if you're here today. And if you are, I probably don't need to go into too much detail about why the firm performance construct is so important. But there are so many quotes that support this, and I've provided a few of them here. The first, it's at the heart of strategic management. Understanding persistent heterogeneity in firm performance is perhaps the central objective. Explaining organizational performance is at the heart of the strategy literature. I mean, it is not difficult to find quotes like this. And in fact, you can't even really define strategic management without also including firm performance, right? And there have been studies on that as well. And so I think it's probably the most important construct in our field. And so I think it's worth talking about and investigating in terms of its measurement and its meaning. So let me kind of tell you my kind of central motivation for my research in this area. And that is this standard equation. And I'll come back to this in a moment, this equation. But you've seen some variation, I'm sure, of this equation in the past. You have something on the left, we'll call it net income divided by total assets, which many of us will see as ROA. And you'll see some sort of independent variable on the right, R&D expenditures scaled by total sales or total assets maybe. And then there's also a control variable for firm size, and it's usually logged. And this is kind of a typical empirical model in strategy research. And now we might change the denominator slightly. These might both be the same. They might both be total sales. They might be employees, and the numerators might be different. Might be cash flows, or might not be. It might be operating income instead of net income. But the idea is the same, and that is that we have these firms of different sizes in our data sets, and we're trying to understand how they perform over time. And we try to make adjustments for this in some way. But this has always like really bothered me, right? Because why are we doing all of this, right? We've got, we scale for it on the left-hand side, we scale for it on the right-hand side. We also include another variable to control for firm size. It seems strange to me. And so this has really kind of been the impetus for my research in this area. Just read paper after paper, and I'm sure many of you have, and you're just kind of wondering why people do what they do, right? Okay, so in these papers, I just wanted to, before I get into them, talk about my co-authors just for a moment. All of these people are either at ASU or once were at ASU as PhD students. And so as a team, we have been looking at, they're not all on all of these papers, but different groups of them are on different papers, and they've been instrumental in this research. And for my learning, I've learned so much from all of them as we investigate these topics. So let me get into my first kind of statement, or provocative statement, maybe. And only in academics can a sentence like this can someone even try to claim that this is provocative, right? But many performance measures are ratios, and ratios are problematic in statistical models. So I should say, so this paper, what I'm going to talk about, is from a paper in 2020 on ratios in ORM. Now, let me revisit this equation that I had. So what we try to do in this paper is look at how ratios influence statistical models. We all use ratios. We have seen them in statistical models, but we also just kind of see them in the news. People talk about things like earnings per share, and they're really popular, right? And so we wanted to see, like, does this matter? Does this matter for statistical models, whether or not people use ratios? Now, it turns out that, even as strange as they sound to us, people in other fields provide even more provocative statements about the problems with ratios. And so they're used in almost every field. And so there seems to be in almost every field also a small group of researchers who is saying, why are we doing this? Why are we trying to scale everything? So there are a couple quotes that I love here. Empirical researchers love ratios. Statisticians loathe them. Okay, so real statisticians do not like ratios. A ratio is seductively simple. There is just one problem. The analysis of a ratio is complex. Okay, so we're beginning to see that there's some pushback from statisticians about using ratios in everyday models. So I thought this was really interesting in working on this paper. Pearson, that Pearson, okay, in 1896. Okay, so before 1900, noted problems with ratios. Okay, I found this fascinating when we kind of stumbled upon this. And so what he did is he tried to approximate the relationship between two ratios, the correlation between two ratios. And so I don't want to, dive down too deep into the weeds on this, but you can see that we have a dependent variable y over z1, which is this denominator, and x over z2, which is another denominator. And he said, if you want to look at the correlation, so think of this as, let's call it, just as I did, return on assets and R&D intensity. Okay, if you really want to see the correlation between those two ratios, here's the formula he provided back then. Okay, and it is a long formula. And what you'll see is this is the correlation between the numerators, okay, x and y. So think about net income and R&D. And then it's multiplied by these two, the Vy and Vx. And V is the coefficient of variation. And this was, prior to this study, was not something I paid attention to, the coefficient of variation, but it is a variable standard deviation divided by its mean. So he was basically saying that if you want to understand this relationship, you have to go through this formula. And he also has a note in there also that he leaves out some lower ordered terms, some other terms, because he doesn't think they're going to be that big of a deal. So it's even more complex than this. And so what we try to do is, okay, well, what happens if this is actually a regression model and not a correlation? So we explored all sorts of different kind of combinations, as I will show you. So what we wanted to do was first look at, what do the coefficients of variation in strategy research look like? And so remember, that's the standard deviation divided by the mean. And so this is straight from the paper, but we took assets and option pay, total compensation, and we looked at the CVs for different data sets. Okay, so if it's the S&P 500, it's 4.9. If it's a small cap, it's 1.8. S&P 1500 is 2.7. You can see there's variation here, right? Look at CEO compensation, right? It's ranges from 1.6 to 0.6. And so you can see that, imagine, let me just take a step back here. Imagine that we have a body of knowledge regarding a relationship between two variables. And we know the coefficient of variation matters. It depends which sample we're using, right? And that because the coefficient of variation will influence the relationship between the ratios. And so now, let me get into what we did with this knowledge. But first, okay, let me talk about this for a second. Just a really witty paper, Cronwall, 1993, talks about, okay, we know there are problems with ratios. What are some of the justifications, okay, for using ratios? And these are quotes from his paper. Everyone else uses a ratio, which is a huge justification in our field, right? Everyone uses ROA. Okay, so that's what we're going to use. The ratio may provide a better model. Ratios are simpler. The ratio is the natural quantity of interest. Now, he also says, and this is the part I really like, this sounds like what one hears from a teenager to justify particularly noxious behavior. All right, so he's basically saying these are all just excuses. Okay, we know there are problems with ratios, but nevertheless, people will stick to these excuses as reasons why to continue their use.